In a world where humans and soul pets live in harmony, each bond between them sparks with shared power and purpose. Those who form the strongest of these bonds, soul pet masters, gain the ability to summon their loyal companions, creatures of immense strength and unique abilities, ready to fight by their side. But hidden in the shadows, a place of twisted dreams and unspoken horrors awaits. In Nightmare Island, where courage meets terror, and only the strongest will endure. He emerged into a large, open clearing, roughly circular in shape and surrounded by a towering wall of wooden spikes. The wall, made of thick logs driven into the ground, rose to a height of 30 meters, forming a barrier that encircled the clearing like a grim, fortress-like structure. This was no ordinary camp. It was a prison, designed to keep those inside from ever escaping. The entrance was guarded by 4 men dressed in green, their faces impassive as they stood watch. Each of them was accompanied by a wolf-like creature, fierce and dangerous, their eyes glinting with a feral intelligence. These beasts were not ordinary animals but soul pets, bound to their masters through a mystical connection that made them both loyal and deadly. The wolves growled as Chu Mu approached, their eyes narrowing as they bared their sharp, gleaming teeth. One of the guards, a man with spiky hair and a cruel smile, called out to him. "Get your ass in here." "Took you long enough," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "If you're any slower, my wolf might mistake you for dinner." Chu Mu ignored the man's taunt, slipping past the wolves without a word. He kept his distance, wary of the creature's snapping jaws, and quickly entered the camp. The spiky-haired guard spat on the ground as he watched him go. "Look at him," he muttered to his companions. "Skinny as a twig. I don't know who thought it was a good idea to bring him here. He won't last a week." The guard beside him, a red-haired man, snorted in agreement. "From what I've heard, it was Leader Xia's idea. He brought the kid in himself. Apparently, he used to be some rich brat from a big family. Offended the wrong people, and now he's here with the rest of the trash." The spiky-haired man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "A rich brat, huh? Figures. Bet he thought he was untouchable. Now look at him, just another dead man walking." The red-haired guard leaned in, lowering his voice. "You know what's interesting? Leader Xia didn't just bring him here to rot. He made the kid sign a soul pact with a white nightmare." The other guards looked at him in shock, their eyes widening. One of them let out a low whistle. "A white nightmare? Seriously? How did Leader Xia even get his hands on something like that?" The red-haired man shrugged, a faint smirk on his lips. "Who knows? But it's not like it matters. The kid's as good as dead anyway. That white nightmare's going to devour his soul sooner or later." The others nodded in agreement, their expressions indifferent. They had seen many children come and go in this place, each one forced into the same twisted ritual. None of them survived for long. The white nightmare was a vicious creature, feeding on the souls of its masters. Only those with extraordinary strength and willpower could hope to survive, and even then, it was a battle that never ended. Chu Mu, meanwhile, was well aware of the grim fate that awaited him. He knew that the white nightmare lurking within his soul was a constant threat, a shadow that would one day consume him if he was not strong enough to resist. Yet he refused to give in to despair. He had survived this long, and he was determined to keep fighting, no matter the odds. The children on this island were not here by choice. They had been brought here, torn from their homes and families, to serve as test subjects in a cruel experiment. Each one had been forced to sign a soul pact with a nightmare, a soul pet known for its dark and malevolent nature. These creatures were bound to their masters, yet they were always hungry, always seeking to feed on the souls of those who dared to command them. The only way to survive was to grow stronger, to cultivate one's own soul until it was powerful enough to resist the nightmare's hunger. It was a brutal, merciless existence, and many of the children fell prey to their own soul pets before they had the chance to escape. For Chu Mu, survival was a daily struggle. He had to remain vigilant, always aware of the danger that lurked within him. He had to become stronger, faster, more resilient, or risk becoming yet another victim of the nightmare's insatiable appetite. The night was dark, the sky hidden behind thick clouds that drifted over the island like a shroud. In the camp's open area, 100 children stood in neat rows, their faces pale and grim. They were all dressed in thin, worn clothes that did little to shield them from the cold wind that swept through the clearing, chilling them to the bone. Standing near the entrance were 3 men in dark clothing, their faces expressionless as they looked over the gathered children. The man in the center, a burly figure with a scarred face, stepped forward, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Today's test is simple," he announced, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Only 50 of you will survive. The rest will die." The children exchanged fearful glances, their hearts pounding as the reality of his words sank in. Half of them would not see the dawn. For some, this would be their last night alive. The man's smile widened as he took in their expressions. As Chu Mu found his place in the formation, the feeling of dread began to settle deep in his chest, a cold, hollow sensation that was as familiar as it was terrifying. He stood at the 4th spot in the 5th row, surrounded by children with faces pale as the dawn, each one a mirror of fear and desperation. He knew, as they all knew, what awaited them. The twisted nature of this test was no secret. They were not all meant to survive it, and half of them would not live to see the morning. Only 50 would walk away. Chu Mu's gaze fell to the ground, his mind already racing through possible scenarios. He had to think fast, to come up with a way to avoid being one of the unlucky 50 who would be claimed by the brutal wolves. There was no way he could fight these creatures, he knew that well enough. The hunting wolves were fearsome beasts, soul pets of formidable strength and size, and their agility was unmatched. Their power alone would make them deadly enough, but their sheer ferocity made them unstoppable killing machines. Having once lived in the comfort and security of his clan, Chu Mu had been trained to understand soul pets, to learn their strengths and weaknesses, their behaviors and tendencies. He remembered how he had sat through lesson after lesson, his teachers explaining the nature of different soul pets, each one more exotic and dangerous than the last. He had learned about the creatures that belonged to the beast kingdom, beings that were wild and untamable, their strength coming from raw instinct and primal power. And within this kingdom, the wolf clan reigned supreme. The hunting wolves that guarded the camp, and that were about to be unleashed upon him and his fellow prisoners, were creatures from this very clan. He knew their type well. With their thick, powerful muscles and agile, deadly movements, they were predators through and through. The wolves before him were likely at the 8th stage, judging from their build and the dark, shadowy sheen of their fur. Wolves at this level were no different than a well-trained soldier armed with a deadly weapon, and their strength was not something that could be overcome by brute force, especially not by unarmed children. If he was to survive, Chu Mu knew his only hope lay in outmaneuvering them. His goal wasn't to defeat these creatures. Such an idea would be foolish. Instead, he would have to evade their attacks, keep himself out of reach, and hope that enough of the others would fall first. It was a grim and terrible thought, but on this island, there was no room for sympathy or hesitation. Survival demanded cold, brutal calculations. Every life taken by the wolves meant one less threat to his own, and each scream, each flash of blood, brought him one step closer to living another day. Suddenly, the eerie silence was shattered by a haunting, blood-chilling howl that pierced the air. The sound was followed by a chorus of similar cries, each one rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to vibrate with hunger and bloodlust. The wolves were calling to each other, their voices mingling into a terrible cacophony that sent a shiver down every child's spine. The wolves were ready, and they were about to be unleashed. A moment later, with a single command from the men overseeing the scene, the wolves surged forward. The 10 creatures, sleek and powerful, broke into a run, their muscles rippling as they closed the distance between themselves and the helpless crowd of children. Their growls filled the air, an ominous prelude to the massacre that was about to unfold. The children scattered, their orderly rows collapsing in an instant as panic took over. Screams and cries rose around Chu Mu as the children pushed and shoved, each one desperate to get away from the edge of the group, to hide within the safety of numbers. But the clearing was not large enough to hold them all, and no matter how much they struggled and fought, the weaker ones were pushed to the outskirts, where the wolves were already beginning their merciless attack. The first scream was sharp and brief, cut off as quickly as it had begun. Chu Mu's eyes darted toward the source of the sound, just in time to see a pale-faced boy's arm caught in the jaws of a particularly large hunting wolf. The creature's teeth had sunk deep into the flesh, and as it jerked its head back, the boy's arm was torn from his body in a spray of blood. The wolf's lips curled back, and it snarled a low guttural sound, the torn limb hanging from its mouth as the blood dripped onto the ground. More cries soon followed, each one more desperate and agonized than the last. In every direction, Chu Mu saw flashes of movement, glimpses of children falling to the ground as the wolves tore into them with claws and fangs. The hunting wolves attacked with a savage efficiency, their movements swift and calculated. Their claws, long and white as bone, slashed through flesh with ease, their teeth sinking deep into the soft throats and torsos of their prey. The wolves worked methodically, their instincts guiding them to the weakest, the slowest, those who could not keep up with the frantic chaos around them. The ground was soon slick with blood, the thick, iron-rich scent filling the air. Streams of red ran through the dirt, mingling with the mud as the wolves' relentless assault continued. The children's cries grew weaker, their voices hoarse from screaming, and those who still had the strength to move crawled away, their faces streaked with dirt and tears as they dragged themselves through the carnage. Yet around them, the men who watched showed no sign of compassion. They stood at the edges of the clearing, their expressions cold and detached, some of them even smiling as they observed the horrific spectacle unfolding before them. Their cruelty was boundless, their indifference as deep as the wolves' hunger. To them, this was no more than another test, another demonstration of the island's merciless nature. Chu Mu had managed to keep to the center of the group, avoiding the wolves' initial onslaught. But as more and more children were picked off, his position became increasingly precarious. The throng around him grew thinner, and the wolves began to notice him, their eyes gleaming with a predatory light as they drew closer. Just ahead of him stood a boy named Zhou Shengma. Chu Mu remembered him well. Zhou Shengma was one of the few who had shown promise among the children sent to the island. He was slightly older, stronger, his physique more developed than that of the others. His skills had marked him as a potential survivor, someone who might have a chance at enduring the island's trials. But survival on this island was a lonely battle, and friendship was a luxury no one could afford. Chu Mu knew that compassion was a weakness, a weight that would drag him down and lead him to ruin. Zhou Shengma was just another obstacle, another person who stood between him and survival. So when he saw the hunting wolf closing in on Zhou Shengma, Chu Mu remained still, his gaze cold as he watched the scene unfold. Zhou Shengma, too, saw the wolf coming. His face went pale, and he took a step back, his body tense with fear. His movements were quick, his reflexes honed by years of fighting to stay alive, and he managed to dodge the wolf's initial attack. But it was only a temporary reprieve. The wolf was relentless, its body poised for another strike, its eyes locked onto its target with a hunger that could not be sated. Then, in a moment of desperation, Zhou Shengma's gaze landed on Chu Mu. For a brief, fleeting instant, there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. He saw Chu Mu as a way out, a chance to escape the wolf's deadly focus. Without hesitation, Zhou Shengma lunged toward Chu Mu, his hands reaching out as he used his weight and strength to push him forward. Caught off guard, Chu Mu stumbled, his balance lost as Zhou Shengma's body collided with his. He felt the boy's hands grab him, the force of the shove sending him sprawling toward the wolf. His body lurched forward, and before he could fully comprehend what was happening, he found himself face to face with the creature's gaping maw. The hunting wolf's jaws were inches from his face, its teeth sharp and gleaming, the front canines each a terrifying 20 centimeters long. The stench of blood and decay filled his nostrils, and he could feel the wolf's hot breath against his skin, its dark eyes locked onto him with a deadly intent. Time seemed to slow, the world around him fading into the background as he stared into the wolf's open mouth, the rows of teeth waiting to sink into his flesh. In that moment, Chu Mu's survival instincts took over. His mind raced, his senses sharpening as he searched for a way out. He knew he had only seconds to act, a narrow window of opportunity before the wolf's teeth would close around him. Summoning every ounce of strength and agility he possessed, Chu Mu twisted his body, throwing himself to the side with a burst of speed. His movements were quick, desperate, a last-ditch attempt to escape the wolf's deadly bite. He could feel the creature's teeth graze his skin, a sharp, stinging sensation that sent a jolt of pain through his body. But he had managed to avoid the full force of the attack, slipping just out of reach as he rolled across the ground. He scrambled to his feet, his body tense as he prepared for the wolf's next move. The creature turned to face him, its eyes narrowing.
The sound of footsteps echoed behind Chu Mu, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the eerie silence of the camp. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that threatened to drown out his thoughts. He didn't need to turn around to know what was coming. The hunting wolf that had missed its earlier strike was now closing in, its predatory instincts honed on him. Chu Mu's mind raced, a whirlwind of fear and determination. He couldn't afford to panic. Not now, not when death was so close. He forced himself to breathe, to think. The hunting wolves were relentless, their attacks precise and deadly. Chu Mu remembered their abilities, drilled into him during the countless hours of training and observation. If his guess was correct, the wolf would use the violent wolf's demonic strike, a flurry of claw attacks designed to overwhelm and destroy. Even a grown adult would struggle to survive 4 strikes, let alone a 15-year-old boy. Chu Mu clenched his teeth, his body tensing as he prepared for the inevitable. He couldn't run. The wolf was too fast. He couldn't fight. He was unarmed and outmatched. His only chance was to minimize the damage and wait for an opening. With a sharp inhale, he ducked and curled himself into a ball, his arms shielding his head and his legs tucked tightly against his chest. It was a risky move. Lying flat might have avoided the initial strikes, but it would leave him vulnerable to the wolf pouncing on him. By curling into a ball, he protected his vital organs and created a smaller target. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best he could do. The hunting wolf lunged, its claws slashing through the air with a cold metallic gleam. The violent wolf's demonic strike was as brutal as Chu Mu had feared. Four rapid claw strikes tore through the space where he had been standing moments ago. The first three missed, the wolf's claws slicing harmlessly through the air as Chu Mu crouched low. But the fourth strike found its mark. Sila! The sound of tearing flesh was sickening, a wet, visceral noise that made Chu Mu's stomach churn. The claw ripped into his back, leaving a deep, jagged wound. Pain exploded through his body, sharp and searing, like a brand pressed against his skin. Blood poured from the wound, warm and sticky, soaking into his tattered clothing. Chu Mu bit down on his lip, stifling a cry. He couldn't afford to show weakness. Not here, not now. The wolf would sense it, and it would only make him an easier target. He forced himself to stay still, to endure the pain, even as his vision blurred and his body trembled. The wolf paused, its chest heaving as it prepared for another attack. This was Chu Mu's chance. With a surge of adrenaline, he pushed himself to his feet and bolted, his legs pumping as he sprinted toward the edge of the camp. The wolf snarled behind him, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. His only focus was survival. The camp was a nightmare come to life. The ground was slick with blood, the air thick with the metallic tang of death. Bodies lay scattered across the field, small and broken, their lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. The rain had started to fall, a cold, relentless drizzle that washed away the blood but did nothing to cleanse the horror of what had happened. Chu Mu's breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning as he ran. His back throbbed with every step, the wound pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He could feel the blood dripping down his spine, pooling at the base of his back. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The sound of clapping echoed through the camp, sharp and mocking. Chu Mu skidded to a halt, his chest heaving as he turned to face the source of the noise. The foremen stood at the edge of the field, their faces impassive as they surveyed the carnage. The middle-aged man in the lead, the one who had orchestrated this massacre, stepped forward, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Congratulations," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've survived. For now." Chu Mu's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but he knew it would be pointless. The foremen were untouchable, their power absolute. All he could do was stand there, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain, and listen. "Starting tomorrow, you'll be free to explore the island," the man continued, his tone casual, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the lives of the children before him. "There are countless soul pets here, waiting to be tamed. Choose wisely. In 3 months, you'll face a decisive duel. The top 10 will be sent to another island for further training. The rest," he paused, his smile widening. "Well, let's just say the sharks will be well fed." The children around Chu Mu paled, their faces etched with fear and despair. The man's words were a death sentence, a reminder that their survival was temporary, a fleeting reprieve before the next wave of horrors. "And don't forget," the man added, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "the nightmares within you are always hungry. If you don't grow stronger, they'll devour your souls. So I suggest you start training. Unless, of course, you enjoy the idea of being eaten alive." With that, the foreman turned and left, their laughter echoing through the camp. The children were left alone, their small forms huddled together in the rain. Some wept openly, their sobs mingling with the sound of the falling rain. Others stood in silence, their faces blank, their spirits broken. Chu Mu didn't cry. He couldn't. His body was too exhausted, his mind too numb. He stared at the ground, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear, anger, and determination. He had survived today, but he knew the worst was yet to come. The wooden houses stood in a neat row along the edge of the camp, their weathered planks creaking in the wind. They were simple structures, little more than shelters, but they were a stark contrast to the blood-soaked field behind them. Chu Mu trudged toward his assigned house, his steps heavy and unsteady. His back still bled, the wound throbbing with every movement. As he approached the door, a sudden splash of water hit his back, sending a jolt of pain through his body. He hissed, spinning around to face the source of the attack. Zhou Xingma stood there, a smirk plastered across his face. "What luck you have," Zhou sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "You didn't even die in this kind of way." Chu Mu's eyes narrowed, his hands clenching into fists. Zhou Shengma was one of the few children who seemed to thrive in this hellish environment. He was larger than most, his body thick with muscle, and he had a cruel streak that made him dangerous. Chu Mu had no doubt that Zhou would kill him if given the chance. "Truthfully, I was helping you back there," Zhou continued, his smirk widening. "When the nightmare devours your soul, you'll wish the wolf had finished you. At least then it would have been quick." Chu Mu didn't respond. He turned and pushed open the door to his wooden house, stepping inside and slamming it shut behind him. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with 4 beds arranged against the walls. It had once been shared by 3 others, but now it was empty. Chu Mu was the only one left. He moved to his bed, his movements slow and deliberate. The pain in his back was unbearable, but he forced himself to focus. He needed to clean the wound, to stop the bleeding before it weakened him further. He grabbed a bucket of water and a rag, wincing as he tried to reach the wound on his back. "Let me help you." The voice startled him, and he spun around, his body tensing. Tingyu stood in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the dim light. She was drenched from the rain, her hair plastered to her face, but she looked unharmed. "You didn't die," Chu Mu said, his voice hoarse. Tingyu nodded, stepping into the room. "I survived by a fluke. Let me help you with that." Chu Mu hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to refuse. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, not here. But the pain in his back was too much to ignore, and he knew he couldn't treat the wound on his own. Reluctantly, he nodded. Tingyu moved quickly, her hands steady as she cleaned the wound and applied a salve from Chu Mu's supplies. The pain lessened slightly, and Chu Mu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Today I helped you," Tingyu said as she finished bandaging the wound. "In the future, if I need help, you'll return the favor. Is that okay?" Chu Mu nodded, his expression grim. "I'll try my best." Tingyu sat on her bed, her knees drawn up to her chest. "My cyan nightmare is growing fast. In 10 days, it might reach the 3rd stage. I'm scared my soul power won't be enough to sustain it." Chu Mu didn't respond immediately. He knew the risks of the nightmares better than anyone. The creatures were parasites, feeding on their host's soul power to grow stronger. If the host couldn't keep up, the nightmare would devour their soul. "Try your best," Chu Mu said finally. "If you don't want to die, you have to get stronger." Tingyu nodded, but her expression was troubled. "I feel like you're not even worried. Are you confident you'll survive?" Chu Mu's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "I'm not confident, but I don't have a choice." The truth was, Chu Mu's situation was far worse than Tingyu realized. While the others had cyan nightmares, Chu Mu harbored a white nightmare, a far more dangerous and insatiable creature. Its growth was exponential, and its hunger was relentless. The foremen had already written him off as dead, and Chu Mu knew they were probably right. But he refused to give up. He would fight, no matter the odds. He would survive, no matter the cost.